So the first thing I wanted to do in talking about Schiele today is just to understand where we are, and to talk about the show title real quick. John Margiari, who is our curator of European art and who curated this show, will be the first one to tell you that really the real title of the show is The Human Beast, German and Austrian Expressionism at the San Diego Museum of Art. And there are more, yes, people who were involved in the movement in Germany represented within the show, but in terms of the importance of the type of art that was coming out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and specifically Vienna, had just as much impact on the movement as anything else. So we're talking about Egon Schiele in Vienna. We need to understand that at this time, Vienna is undergoing an incredible change. From 1850 to 1900, this is a town whose population quadruples. So by the time you get to 1900, you've gone from 500,000 to just over 2 million people. So imagine living, here in San Diego, what would happen if our population just quadruples in the next 50 years, a very short amount of time. Less than half of those 2 million people were born there. This is mostly people coming from the far reaches of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I'm going to learn how to say that before we're done today. Are coming because there's this huge boom. A lot of it is industrialization, but there's a lot of jobs that are springing up in Vienna. And so there's all these people coming into the city. Now, it is a promised land, definitely. People are hearing about these jobs and they want a better way of life, and so they're leaving a lot of rural areas to come to Vienna. Of course, what they find themselves living in is some of the worst slums in all of Europe. I mean, the city, for a couple of different reasons. For one, just couldn't keep up with this huge influx of people, and so the structure wasn't there in the city to handle this huge influx. But curiously, at the same time, the technocrats of Vienna are sort of building this monument to themselves, which is called the Ringstrasse. And it's this huge, basically, ring that goes around the old city. And it's this new wide boulevard full of new opera houses and museums and billionaire estates. So there's this new symbol of the city going up at the same time when there's incredible amounts of poverty, only ramping up more and more. At the same time, this is the crossroads of Europe. So all the trains, from France to Russia are going through Vienna. All this trade is going through Vienna, one of the reasons why it's a booming city. So all these different people are attracted to come there. And the one thing that they have, if nothing else, in Vienna is they have great art at this time. Now, Vienna had, only 50 years before been this smaller city of 500,000 people. So actually, one of the radical things that happens is they're exposed to all this new art, and we'll get to that with Gustav Klimt in a moment. But even things like the French Impressionists and especially the Post-Impressionists weren't incredibly well known to a lot of the citizens, especially the collectors of Vienna during the last part of the 19th century. And then the last part of the context of the city is who's hanging out there. So when I say you have everybody coming there, you have people like Sigmund Freud coming to the city, and he's talking, he's really developing his ideas about a lot of things, including sex and about our libidos and how that drives everything in humanity, and it's all about sex, 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 sex. And you have people like Karl Kraus, who very soon after the end of World War I, is writing the last days of humankind, and this is all about what's happening to our societies, and there's this new middle class that's emerging, and the old way of life is changing. And that's certainly happening in a place like Vienna. You have Stalin, Trotsky, Hitler, Herzl, all hanging out in Vienna at the same time at the cafes, figuring out what is going to be the best policy and government to rule Europe in the future. You have an incredible amount of playwrights and novelists hanging out at the same cafes, and they're picking up on these ideas of sex and death, and they're putting them into all the new plays that are coming out. This is a city Basically, the context I want to give you is this is a city that, yes, is undergoing incredible change, and especially socioeconomic change, but it's also a city that, for a lot of different reasons, seems to be obsessed with sex and with death. So now, establishing that, now we can talk about our friend Egon Schiele, a man who, at 15 years old, has already had sort of a troubled childhood. His father passes away when he's 15 years old of syphilis. So you have this incredible, impactful death in his life, and it's due to a sexually transmitted disease. So that has done a lot to Schiele's psyche by the time he ever gets into art school, which is after his father passes away. He's got an uncle that's taking care of him, and Schiele's only good at two things. He's really good at gym class, and he's really good at art class. And so this uncle doesn't really know what to do with him, and he's kind of a troublemaker. So he sends him off to Vienna to college. He goes to the arts and crafts school. It's not really for him. So he goes to really one of the best art schools in Vienna, hangs out there for about 3 years. And it's so conservative, he just can't take it anymore. So he quits school, never finishes art school, and he's in Vienna, this crazy cosmopolitan city that, I mean, it's really hard. I mean, it's a hard city to live in. And so he seeks out Gustav Klimt. This is a young Schiele who's in search of a father figure now, if not ever before. And so the first thing he does is he goes and tries to find this guy who's been leading a very important new movement that we now call the Vienna Secession movement, starting in the last decade of the 19th century. And Gustav Klimt is the man at the head of that. And so Schiele goes out and seeks out Gustav Klimt. So now what we're going to do is go look at 2 drawings by Klimt very quickly, and then come back to talk about this work right here. Very quickly, we've got 2 just incredible drawings here by Klimt. And of course, when we look at women with flowered kimono, I'll just pass around one of the more iconic images of Klimt that we all recognize very quickly. You can see a man who is, even in his just rough drawing, very concerned with pattern, with decoration. And there is a preciousness to a lot of these drawings that I want to invite everyone to look at in terms of the way he's really fidgeting with these lines. And for someone who in his paintings comes out and is so bold and geometric, and his lines are so hard, if not calligraphic, it's nice to see some of these more precious drawings where there's really a fussiness with the line and him working out the drawing. So, I don't know if we know about this woman, but certainly over here, these 2 standing nudes, we have every reason to believe that these are some of the prostitutes that Klimt used in his studio. And so what we'll do is go back over to the Schiele drawing, and I just wanted to highlight who these were, because there's all this, I think Schiele does have such a, sort of juicy, scandalous biography that we want to make a lot of a fuss about the fact that he's using prostitutes in his studio, when actually that's very commonplace, especially in Vienna. And if he learns that anywhere, he learns that from his great teacher, Gustav Klimt. But Klimt, like I said, can play the role of father figure to this young artist. Yes, he mentors a lot of artists, but with Schiele especially, he takes him under his wing, and he finds him a studio and finds him people that donate materials to him. He finds him the patrons. He puts him in all of the best shows that he's working on. So he really uses his status to highlight this young artist and then get him started. And so we see a couple of things. One, we see literally in Schiele's early work this clear indebtedness to the style of Klimt, where yes, he's working in the same style, but even also taking Klimt's subjects, paintings that he's already done, and reworking them as his own paintings or drawings. So he's really learning from Klimt's existing body of work. But also just in his loyalty to Klimt. Klimt obviously goes through his own ups and downs and leaves the secession movement that he helped found. And Schiele really always stays by his side throughout that. So there's this incredible bond between these 2 artists. Let's go back over and actually talk about our drawing here in our. I want to just remind everyone that indeed it is ours. It's in our permanent collection now, which is part of the reason we have this show, to celebrate these types of things. So one thing we can realize is looking at this date, this is 1913, Schiele has gone through his own hard time in Vienna. He was arrested on charges of abducting and seducing young women. All those charges are dropped, but he is convicted of opening up his studio, which did contain what the authorities deemed pornographic material, making that available to minors to see. So that was still an offense. By the time they sentence him, he's already been in jail 3 weeks, and so they give him a couple more days and then let him out. So he decides to get out of town, and that has everything to do with the painting that we'll end on in just a second. But when he comes back, he's making a lot more paintings, and this trial, if anything, has actually helped him in terms of his career. So we want to believe this myth about Schiele starving to death and, you know, like making his art out of really dire circumstances. And the truth is he had, because of Klimt, some collectors that really did provide for him a tolerable living. Now, part of the problem is he's miserable with his finances, and he just spends money basically on parties, having a good time as fast as he can get it. But he's making all these drawings because he is starting to get attention, and he's starting to get attention outside of Vienna. And so dealers want his work, and so he starts making a lot more drawings, which he knows that he can sell and he can ship a lot more easily than these big paintings. He does get actually into printmaking for a year because he thinks that's going to help him sell more stuff, and that doesn't really work out. But the drawings are something that he keeps working on. Here, I mean, we can see a little of this fussiness that I was talking about, but he comes back in, and boy, does he have a really sure, sharp line, this calligraphic line that he's working on. But one of the other things that's important to realize when looking at this drawing is that these shows that Klimt is putting him in are not just of people hanging out in Vienna, but one of the things that Klimt is really excited about is exposing the Viennese public to these French post-impressionists that had been working in Paris and all this stuff that had been going on in Western Europe. And of course, what is one thing that the post-impressionists are inspired by? Japanese woodblock prints. So hanging in a show where you might see Klimt's drawing and Schiele's drawing, there is a Japanese woodblock print hanging nearby. And indeed, the Secession, once it finally becomes a group, hangs to critical success more than a few shows of just woodblock prints. And so we can imagine that even if this is translated into a painting, that Schiele still wouldn't really do anything with the background. He enjoys these large swaths of negative space. When he puts these figures into paintings, a lot of times there's nothing really in the background. They are sort of flattened in the space. But one thing that you'll see in those woodblock prints, of course, are just these little areas of intense color. And here, of course, with the nipples, with the lips, we have these intense blobs of red against an otherwise monochrome piece of paper. Another thing is looking at the little bit of color that's put on there. I mean, it's almost kind of translucent. And one thing that Klimt was really passionate about, in fact, the reason Klimt decided to leave the secession movement and go off on his own is he was really interested in the applied arts and folk arts and how vital that was for culture, but also how inspirational that could be for fine artists. And so you see here in this coloring almost this stained glass sort of effect. And stained glass is something that Schiele was really interested in. He was very proud of his collection of toys and knickknacks and stained glass and things like that. And so these are objects that he's looking at in his studio a lot. So very quickly now, we're already a little behind schedule. We'll go end with this amazing oil painting. So this Schiele painting comes out of this 1912 trial that he undergoes. He gets out of there. Very traumatic for Schiele. Like I said, in terms of his own self-worth, in a way, because it's bad enough to get in trouble and have to go to jail. And by the way, if you ever are curious, look up the series of drawings that he did while he was in his jail cell, because they're absolutely fantastic and just this confined space that almost gives you anxiety, a confining feeling looking at him. But they throw away so many of his drawings. The judge takes a candle and burns one of his drawings in the courtroom in front of the artist. So, you know, he's kind of fighting the good fight, but sometimes you can only take so much. Indeed, one thing that unifies, I should say, all of the expressionists in Vienna at this time is they all feel they're tarred with the same brush. And so he does feel, I use those words carefully, he does feel like he's fighting the good fight and he's trying to bring new, interesting culture to the Viennese. But yeah, you can only take so much. So he decides he's going to get out of Dodge for a while. And so this is why he goes to Krummau. I think we wrote it on here, Krummau. Yes, on the label. And this is the town where his mother is born. And so he decides to go back, connect with his roots. It's a very small town, get away from this hard life in Vienna. If you can think for a moment that his actions in Vienna got him in so much trouble, and he's the same person when he goes to Krummau, how do you think the officials in the small town are going to react to his exploits? He does not last long here, but you know, besides just being unnerving for his neighbors and the late nights and the parties and hanging out with the riffraff and things like that, it gets to a point where he is actually literally kicked out of the city by the officials. I mean, he is asked to leave. He is barred from the city. So he goes back to Vienna. This work is not painted while he's in Krummau. Maybe he had every intention of making these big oil landscapes of the city, but like I said, he was kicked out. He did make several drawings while he was there, and one wonders if these were ever going to be, if he ever had stayed there for a long time, if he would have painted them in the same way. Because one thing we notice is that this is an empty city. There's no people here, and this is painted in 1914, 2 years after he has left the city. So just as much as it is a depiction of the city, it's really about his memory of the city. And that's why it's even easier for us to understand why certain things, John writes about this in the label, like this tower, were not really there. Not that there weren't towers in the city, but that certainly wasn't in his view. He sort of added that in. I mean, really, more than any sort of accurate depiction of the city, we're just looking at an accurate portrayal of his memory of the city. Again, looking at this composition, this is a fantastic moment to talk about whether or not someone like Schiele truly belongs in an expressionist show. And there are people who would say he's not an expressionist, and people say, well, he was hanging out and he had sort of the same aims as the expressionists. But a lot of times that argument about whether or not to include him in that dividing line comes down to his indebtedness to Klimt, and the fact that while a lot of other works that you'll see here certainly are indebted to Cubism and Precisionism and things like that, a lot of them are very loose. And Schiele never lets go of the overwhelming attractiveness of the composition overall, sort of, you know, the geometry of the composition, something that he learns from Klimt, and he's never willing to let that go. He's always beholden to those aesthetics of how the ground relates to the figure, of how you can flatten out space and make it all work together. And indeed, you can look at this and once more think of stained glass and think of these folk arts that he's looking at. One of the things that I like to look at, though, is just this river, which you know, prior to the modernists, the secessionists, the expressionists, you always had a lot of depictions of the beautiful blue Danube River and all the rivers in the Balkan countries and Eastern Europe, and you know, so this is the area that's associated with all the German fairy tales. This is where they take place, and he has just that ugliest gray-green, almost brown river color that you can imagine, and indeed. Schiele had a very pessimistic outlook on society, on urban society and where it was going, and certainly what it was doing to the environment. And if you read any of his writings, he talks about Vienna as a dead city, as where things die. Again, this is not Vienna, but you can see sort of that same mindset there. The other reason is that being so indebted to Klimt and having your work remind people of Klimt, when Schiele, right at the end of his life, is invited to finally exhibit outside of Vienna and is given these shows in Germany, It's got everybody who's important in there. It's got Emil Nolde, it's got Kokoschka, it's got all the big names, but they very seldom include Klimt, because while he is an important figure, sort of this godfather figure to the Expressionists, he is already of a past age. He's already the previous generation. And so the younger artists want to show their works with each other and not with the previous generation. And because Schiele's work looks so much like Klimt, you know, it reminds them of this previous generation. A lot of times he's right on that borderline between being an expressionist or not. Just to close, like I said, I started off with talking about living in this town that's obsessed with sex and death. And the last days for Schiele are truly the last days of the world that he had grown up in, which is the Habsburg Empire. He dies October 31 of 1918. I believe World War I ends November 11th, but when he's on his deathbed, the foreign officials are already in Vienna. They're already figuring out how to divide up the empire and what the new nation states are going to be. Schiele dies of influenza and dies very, very quickly. I mean, I think he contracts it and dies in the same week. His pregnant wife died 4 days before he did, also of influenza. And so what does he do with those last 3 days of his life after she has passed away? He makes drawings of his deceased wife. And so the last works that we have of Egon Schiele are all these drawings of his dead wife. And then he passes away, like I said, just a few days afterwards. So that's a little bit about Schiele in the context of this huge, mammoth, gargantuan exhibition. I'm sure we'll be talking about these artists and bringing them back out for different exhibitions here and there in the near future. So thank you all for hanging out. Appreciate it.
Thank you.